Let's talk more about the crumbling concrete in schools with Anne Longfield. She's the former Children's Commissioner for England. She's now the chair of the Commission on Young Lives. Good morning to you, Anne.
Morning, Julia.
Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, it is just extraordinary to discover at the end of last week that a bunch of schools might be unsafe, might not be able to open today, tomorrow, when schools return, when they've been off for the last couple of months, could have been dealt with. And of course, it would turn out, apparently, everyone in the Department for Education knew about this problem with this Raac concrete for a couple of decades. What do you make of this?
Well, it's just a complete mess. Whichever way you look at it, I think it's a mess. Parents and children were, looking forward to the start of this new term of what was either being told was the first new normal, if you like. The exams are back to normal. This was the first year of normality. And then just so soon before the school term was meant to start, this devastating news. And I think for parents, it's just a really painful reminder of the disruption during the pandemic and the plunge back into that confusion and uncertainty. I just think that, parents and children to some extent are just steeling themselves for what comes next.
Well, indeed, although it'd be quite nice to have an extra week off. Now we've actually finally got summer arriving, just as school
Well, the
goes
weather
back.
helped,
I mean, but again, not so good. I can imagine an awful lot of parents who especially with young children, last week we're just sort of keeping their fingers crossed. We're going to get through one more week, kids going back, thank goodness. We know how much time at school children
have got jobs.
Well, indeed. Except people actually have to earn a living, pay some taxes to pay for schools. Well, Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, she has said that most schools that are affected will actually still be open today. But they did confirm over the weekend that 156 schools in England were at risk. We know other schools in Wales and Scotland are also at risk. But 104 of those 156 schools have been told you're going to have to either move out completely or close some buildings. And children moving to remote learning. Well, one thing we discovered during 2020 and 2021 is even for the schools that did provide good remote learning is there's not much learning going on.
Well, I mean, yes, remote learning is cannot hold its own against being in the classroom. And of course, it's those disadvantaged kids that don't have the laptops, don't have the Wi-Fi, don't have the home environment where they're able to learn in that suffer the greatest in this. I really get concerned about this kind of automatic default towards home learning, as though that's just always on the cards. Education isn't an optional extra. We used to think it was really important for schools to be open, good schools, and that actually education should be one of our, most important national endeavours. Well, the Treasury doesn't seem to agree with that, if we, believe what we've been told in the news. But also, we've had this carousel of education secretaries over the last year, 10 different education secretaries. Not one of them has been able to spend more than a few months looking at this, and it shows.
Yeah, it really does show, doesn't it? That lack of expertise and ability to get things done, get your feet under the desk and actually be able to deal with things. What do you make of the idea that, this is something that has been on the cards for a long time? Some people are saying, well, civil servants should have dealt with this. Others saying, well, Labour knew about it. These buildings were built in 1950s, 1960s. Apparently it's hospitals, it's council buildings, other public buildings as well. Cheap and cheerful, Raac concrete, brilliant. And it turns out there's a problem with it. And actually it's like a building with an aero bar and basically it can crumble at any time. But the late 90s, this was all flagged up. Could have been dealt with when the sun was definitely shining in the early 2000s. And then, of course, Tories have been in charge the last 13 years. I'm asking my audience today, who do you blame? Do you think anyone, anybody, any particular person is to blame? And who do you blame?
Well, I mean, when we look at our public buildings that were built, 150 years ago, they're still standing and look very solid. We used to think that was important, that civic pride. And clearly putting cheap and cheerful concrete in has been a disaster at this stage. But there was a programme called Building Schools for the Future that was a really sizable programme, which was looking to prepare schools for, the next 10, 20 years. Now, Michael Gove's actually said it's one of his biggest regrets that he cancelled that early on in his time as Secretary of State. He said it was, it wasn't good value for money and it wasn't being focused, and he cancelled that. Well, 6 years later, he said that was one of his biggest regrets. And I just think if we had that in place over the last 13 years, not only we would have had much better fabric of our schools, but we would have known about this and been able to address it many, many years in advance.
Although, of course, these were PFI projects, they were massive in budget, they would be costing those schools an absolute fortune now. There are better ways of doing it. Do you think this also is an ongoing issue? We've had this ever since 2010, where we had the, the new government coming in and the austerity, again, something that actually they were following, what Labour plans on spending and tax at the time as well. So, again, I've never understood people say it was completely outlandish policy, plague on everyone's houses in that sense, if there was a fault there. But so much focus going on healthcare, so much focus in the last few years, and even, during the austerity years, that we had to have a focus on healthcare, when the healthcare spending is largely going on people in the final years of their life. And as always, again and again and again, it is young people at the beginning of their lives who miss out.
Well, Julia, from our conversations over many, many months, even years, that, my view is that children do get overlooked in decision making. They're not voters. Often we're looking to the future with children about, supporting them as they move towards adulthood, and they're too easily overlooked. And that certainly happens. I mean, this is our workforce of the future. We want our workforce. We want our society to be productive. We want it to be independent. You don't get that without supporting children as they grow up. And at the heart of that is making sure that children can learn not only, in high quality education in school, but also the best environments. Yep. And again, it's the kids in the most disadvantaged areas that have the poorest schools and need the largest help. And yet again, they've been we're not talking about being in fancy great halls. I mean, I was in a comp with a flat roof that leaked in most classrooms, and porter cabin for an entire year. I don't think that necessarily impairs your ability to learn, but basically, being in a classroom where the ceiling might not collapse today is probably something, a bare minimum we should look for. Can I ask you also about the children when they do actually go to school, whether or not actually enough of them are doing it at all in the first place? Latest figures showing 1 in 5 children regularly missing school. This is on top of that figure, horrific, 100, 150,000 who just disappeared since COVID. They're just not going in at all. This is a huge issue, isn't it? It's a massive issue. I mean, anyone, when they look at those figures of children who aren't going to to attend regularly, are just astounded. A fifth of our children don't go in one day every fortnight, and 125,000 of them don't go in more than they do go in. Now, just the sheer numbers of that. I spoke to one school and they said out of a roll of about 1,200, a secondary school, they said, well, we've got 500 children that are persistently absent, and 200 of those are severely absent, i.e. 50% of the time or more. Now, they've got 2 attendance officers. That's not going to do it. This is a long-term complicated issue. Need real work with families, work with children to get them into school. It's not going to happen just overnight. And
again, you can just sort of shout and beat the stick and just hope that, parents still, find them. But actually, there's so much more going on at home often. I'm absolutely not absolving parents of their responsibility there, but there's a lot more going on.